And so we're excited to bring you just a few updates on early voting trends and other things that we've seen happening across the state today in regards to the election. And I'll kick it over to Lucy to start us off.
Yeah, so starting broadly with just kind of some key data points for statewide turnout. So over 4.2 million voters turned out during early voting statewide. This was an increase of almost 600,000 early voters, which is 16% from 2020. So seeing this was record-breaking engagement with over 500,000 more voters in 2024 than 2020 so far in early voting. And then this chart, I don't know if is it showing up? Okay, so this chart shows the daily trends. You can see kind of that this orange area here is the 2024 totals by day, and they're steadily at a higher rate turnout than 2020 totals. And those dips are just weekend turnout numbers, which is consistent with 2020 as well. And then by counties, breaking it down a little bit, the highest turnout that we saw was in Wake and Mecklenburg counties, with a total combined increase in turnout from 2020 of about 150,000. And this is in line with the two counties that have the most registered voters as well. And only 14 counties after the whole period of early voting ended with lower turnout than 2020. And this was mostly very minimal in either the double or triple digits. One of the most notable ones with a decrease in turnout from 2020 would be Cumberland, which is where Fayetteville is. This is just notable because it ranks 6th in the number of registered voters. But again, the decrease for Cumberland was relatively minimal. And a couple other counties that saw interesting trends. New Hanover County saw significant decreases in turnout the first 6 days of early voting, but they were able to turn things around for the rest of the early voting period with a 12% increase from 2020 overall in early voting. And then Brunswick, a neighboring county to New Hanover, on the other hand, saw significant increases early on in the voting period and continued very strong throughout and had kind of record-breaking turnout, up 42% compared to 2020. And then another important area to note is Western North Carolina, seeing the impacts of Hurricane Helene. So there was 25 states under the state disaster law in North Carolina. And throughout the early voting period, we saw some of those counties struggle. But by the end, none of those counties saw lower turnout than 2020, which was a really, really good sign. Specifically, Buncombe County, the biggest county in Western North Carolina, which is where Asheville is, saw decreases in the first week of early voting, but turned things around significantly with very high turnout towards the end and remainder of the period, finishing with a almost 10% increase from 2020. And then demographics. So the demographic trends kind of showed the type of people that were represented the most during early voting, which was non-Hispanic white voters, Republican voters, female voters, and those over the age of 41. One thing to note is that unaffiliated voters make up about a third of North Carolina's registered voters, but we're relatively underrepresented at the polls. But I think this is important to note because since this is such a big group, we can't make too much of Democratic or Republican turnout alone. And then 10 out of the 11 early voting sites on HBCU campuses saw turnout exceeding 2020 levels as well. But really, demographics-wise, it's a little bit too early to draw big conclusions from this information with, who's going to show up on election day and things like that. And then these are just some visuals of what we just saw, who's turning out to vote the most, the younger population, not as present at the polls in early voting. And then you see race and ethnicity and by political party as well. So I just wanted to end things with some of the big takeaways. So we see turnout is high, but there's still a lot more votes out there. We have about 7.8 million registered voters in North Carolina. 4.2 million have already cast their votes during early voting. That's about 54% turnout, so good turnout, but there's a lot more votes to come. And then counties with the most registered voters are seeing highest turnouts, like I said, with Wake and Mecklenburg County, with a few exceptions, like I mentioned, just Cumberland County, significantly low turnout, and then Buncombe's increase being lower than usual, likely due to Hurricane Helene's impact. And then moving forward, some of the things that we'll be watching is counties with lower turnout than usual, seeing if they can increase their numbers on election day today. Counties with high turnout, if they can continue those trends and continue their high turnout through election day. And then broader contextual issues, if there are issues like long lines, voter intimidation, those kind of things that could impact voting. So I'll pass it to Brian.
Thank you, Lucy. And so you kind of ended talking about some of the context that makes this election a little bit different. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what that context is and what folks' experiences at the polls have been so far. So there's a lot of things that make the 2024 election different than previous ones, but most notably, in North Carolina, we've seen a large swath of new election-related laws. And that's from the way that voters interact at the polls to the way that elections are administered. And so, for example, we've already started to see the impacts of voter ID in regards to the amount of calls and questions we're getting in. We have, the printing delays and mailing delays of absentee ballots made a lot of news earlier in the election cycle. And that's something we'll continue to keep an eye on to understand if that has an impact on the number of absentee and mail-in ballots that we're getting in. We've also seen the impacts of the hurricane and the natural disaster in the western part of the state. We've seen election workers, poll workers go above and beyond to make sure that folk are getting their ballots and are able to cast their ballots. I think one of the most kind of impactful data points on that is what Lucy pointed out in terms of turnout rate for those counties impacted, exceeding 2020 levels. And then there are other other things, such as the removal of the 3-day grace period for voting by mail. And so we won't understand what the impacts of those are until after the conclusion of the election. But all of those are contextual things to keep in mind as we watch the results come in and really analyze what's going on. So just by looking at some of the early voting data, we're able to get a sense of how some of these contextual pieces are impacting the election. So there were over 5,600 provisional ballots cast in the early voting period, and nearly half of those were due to voter ID issues. So if a voter did not have their ID with them, they were able to vote provisionally, or they were able to fill out an exemption form. And so we're able to kind of see how many folk were not able to provide those IDs at the polls. And so we'll continue to watch today to see how that issue impacts voters. Additionally, the North Carolina Nonpartisan Voter Protection Hotline received over 120 calls specifically related to issues of voter ID. Today, the hotline, and it's as of 1:30, has received 49 different calls around ID. I think what's notable is that 30 of those calls have been escalated, which means that 30 of those calls actually required attorneys to try to help to figure out what was going on, figuring out what the issue could have been. We know that that number is an undercount, that we're not capturing everyone who is running into issues with voter ID, but those numbers kind of give us a clue or an indication of how prevalent that issue is. In addition, the impacts of voter ID is pretty broad. So we've seen instances where veterans have been turned away, or where voters who have tribal enrollment cards, all of which are acceptable forms of voter ID, have actually been given misinformation and turned away at the polls. One thing that we are seeing is that in some of these cases, voters are knowledgeable and they're able to cast their votes regardless, but it's still something to keep an eye on. In addition to veterans and folk who are members of Native tribes, we've also seen the impacts of voter ID among students. And so in Fayetteville earlier this voting, or excuse me, during the early voting period, we received reports of students who were denied voting access because of their IDs. Additionally, in Durham, during the early voting period, we saw students receiving information that was inconsistent about whether or not they'd be able to use their IDs or not. So those are some of the examples of how voter ID is impacting or has impacted voters during the early voting period. As we monitor today, we're continuing to see issues and questions around identification. More specifically, there's been instances where voters have noticed that there's been inconsistencies in who's being asked to provide ID, as well as issues continuing around information around what sorts of ID are acceptable or not. And the last thing I'll say about voter ID is that we are seeing some instances where folk are either leaving line to go get their identification or leaving line to go get another form of identification. The point is that there are instances where incorrect information is being provided, and voters should understand that if they are in line, they have the option to fill out a ID exemption form. They are able to vote, and so we're working to make sure that folk have the correct information that they need in order to cast their ballot. In addition to concerns and issues with voter ID, we're also seeing issues with misinformation and voter intimidation. So across the state, we've seen a lot of information coming out around whether or not your ballot will be counted if it's not filled all the way in, which it will. But again, this conflicting information is important to note because it does impact the experience of voters at the polls. And then we've also seen instances of electioneering. And so those are just inappropriate or illegal conversations happening at the voting sites. And so in some instances, there's been issues where signs are actually not in the correct locations, or there's been instances where volunteers have been crossing physical and ethical lines in terms of what they should be communicating with voters. And so we'll be continuing to collect that information throughout the day. And then maybe one of the other issues that has really been prevalent in the voter hotline has been issues of accessibility. And that's been an issue both during the early voting period, and it's something that we've seen going on today as well. So there's been multiple instances where voters just simply cannot access curbside voting. We've read some reports where voters are being questioned about whether or not they should be using curbside voting. But it's important to note that voters have access to curbside voting if it's something that they need. It is a practice of our electoral system to provide them with those accessibility accommodations. In terms of data that we're continuing to watch, in addition to the turnout data, we're keeping an eye on mail-in ballots. So as of the end of the early voting period, nearly 63% of mail-in ballots that were sent back to Board of Elections were accepted and counted. And we're still waiting for about 54% of those ballots, and we'll see later on today. We'll be keeping an eye on that data to see if those and how those ballots are counted. In addition to absentee ballots, we'll continue to keep an eye out on turnout numbers. We will be watching the provisional ballots. That's letting us know if folk had issues at the polls and if they needed to vote in an alternative manner. We'll continue to monitor our voter hotline and take in calls and information that way. We'll have some really pertinent information around experiences at polling places, especially around accessibility, long lines. Those will come from our vote protectors, volunteers later on in the day. And then we'll also continue to watch the canvassing process. So even after polls close today, there's an entire process to make sure that those votes are cast, those votes are counted. And we'll be continuing to monitor that process as well. So when will we know more? Well, polls close today at 7:30. Election day ballots cannot begin to be counted until after 7:30. Ballots cast in the early voting period will also begin to be counted at 7:30. And then the counting of the mail-in ballots will actually start this afternoon, although results, will not be announced until 7:30. So we won't know answers until 7:30, and they'll come in slowly, and we'll continue to make sure that we monitor and give time to election workers to properly count votes, to make sure that the information we have is accurate. And if you're curious about when more information is going to come out or when canvassing is going to occur, when votes will be counted and certified, you can go to dimnc.org/canvass to learn more. We'll also have all of our information at dimnc.org/election 2024. So that's just a little bit about what we're seeing, what we know at this point, and what we can expect to learn later on throughout the day.